no proper training in the Parampara about understanding Bhagavad Gita. And he even went so far, this particular translator that Gorakhpur, the Gita Press was distributing, he even went so far, and he gave the exact page number, page 458, to say that the words of the speaker of Bhagavad Gita, which is of course Sri Krishna, are controversial. They don't agree with each other in the Bhagavad Gita. And Srila Prabhupada just smashed him to smithereens, that you have no right to even touch Bhagavad Gita. You haven't learned Bhagavad Gita from the proper sources. How we must learn Bhagavad Gita. So this principle of not tolerating anyone who touches Bhagavad Gita who's not qualified, he carried on in his further editions of Back to Godhead magazine. Now, after this particular November 20th, 1956, Prabhupada had to stop until 1958. And in 1958, he was only able to publish two issues. In one of those issues, then he spoke about the translation written by Dr. Radhakrishna, who was the vice president of the country at the time. He was known to be a great scholar, and then he quoted some of the anomalies that Dr. Radhakrishna spoke of in his commentaries. It is not to Krishna that we must fully surrender. It is to the unborn within Krishna. So this impersonalism is what destroyed present-day India. Now, I'm going to take it further because this was Prabhupada's platform of preaching, because this was his spiritual master's platform. He would not tolerate impersonalism, false yogis, false avatars, false charlatans who were posing to be leaders, and he was called the walking or the living encyclopedia, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. He knew everything about any topic you asked him. He was so learned, and he insisted his disciples also become learned like that, that the scholars would not even dare to question Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati's disciples. So Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he took on this principle of never compromising. And Prabhupada wrote a letter later in 1973 to one of his leading disciples. He was a manager, Karandar Das. He was in charge of, he was one of the first GBCs in charge of the western side of America. And he explained to him that this chopping technique I learned from my spiritual master, and that we should never compromise. So later, Prabhupada visited Japan. We'll read about this later. But because Prabhupada, from the very start, would not tolerate impersonalism, I just want to give two different examples of how Prabhupada carried this throughout his preaching. So Prabhupada was invited to Japan by Burijan Prabhu. And there's a city in Japan called Kobe. And one Hindu, Mr. Mahesh, had given a third floor, on the third story, his apartment to the devotees. And he had arranged for Prabhupada to speak at the Hindu Society. Now the devotees arranged everything very nicely with the Vyasasan. They were having kirtan. Prabhupada spoke from the Bhagavad Gita. And then Mr. Mahesh introduced another Swami, Swami Kaivalya. So Mr. Mahesh expected Prabhupada to get off of his Vyasasan and have Swami Kaivalya sit on the Vyasasan. So when Mr. Mahesh introduced the Swami, Prabhupada just sat there and he wouldn't move. So the Swami had to go back to his seat and standing had to give his lecture. It was in Hindi, so the devotees couldn't understand it. For half an hour he spoke. And then after half an hour, the devotees noticed that Prabhupada was getting very upset. And suddenly he said, "Stop him!" "Do not let him speak. Start kirtan." The devotees couldn't understand what happened, so they started kirtan. And then they walked out of the hall. So later, Mr. Mahesh came to the apartment. He said, "Swamiji, why did you do that? The people were very upset." Prabhupada said, "I could not tolerate what he was saying." So what he was saying was, he was describing the Panchopasana, that we worship the 5 different deities, Vishnu, Shiva, Parvati, the sun god, and Ganesh. But ultimately, we should give up that worship, reject the deities, and simply merge into the formless Brahman. So when this Swami said that, Prabhupada could tolerate what his nonsense no longer and had the devotees start kirtan. So Mr. Mahesh was arguing with Prabhupada that in the Hindu philosophy, everyone is tolerant. There are many paths to the same goal, to the same truth, and there are many different opinions. Prabhupada said, "Yes, opinions, but I speak from the truth. I speak from the Shastra." And then he started to quote Ishvara Parama Krishna Sachidananda Vigraha, where Krishna is mentioned. He said the Mayavadis, they want to mutilate Krishna. They say all is one. You can worship anyone. We're all God, but Krishna is not God. So don't worship him. So there was a heated argument between Prabhupada and Mr. Mahesh. Finally, Mr. Mahesh stood up. He said, "I don't think this apartment is suitable for this society. It's on the 3rd floor, and the public won't be happy to walk up three flights of steps." And then he walked out of the apartment. And Prabhupada started to laugh. He said, "Actually, he's just attached to his apartment. He wants to take it back from us. And when people become very attached to their apartment, they'll become a mouse in the apartment." So Srila Prabhupada, he did not compromise. He said that the Vedantists, Danta means teeth, and V means without. So when the Vedantists speak their philosophy in front of the Vaishnavas, it's like someone talking without teeth. So this Mayavad philosophy was what Srila Prabhupada, just like when we say, Nirvishesha Sunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine. So this mantra that we chant to Srila Prabhupada every day, that was written by Acharya Prabhakar, his first disciple. It was because people weren't interested in becoming Krishna conscious, because they had no time. That Bhakti Godhead had failed financially. Certain sadhus in India were celebrated and influential, but Abai was not amongst them. Of course, the uncompromising preaching he had learned from his spiritual master, the chopping technique, in which he openly criticized revered politicians and holy men, was not likely to win him favor and patronage. "Don't flatter," Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had said. "Speak the truth, and if Krishna is pleased, then you will come out successful. Money will come." And Abai had firm faith in this. Now also in this last issue of Bhakti Godhead, Srila Prabhupada, he had acknowledgments by very erudite, very highly placed people, such as the Municipal Commissioner of Delhi, the curator of our Mathura Archaeological Museum here, the president of the Theosophical Society in Baroda. He picked out very respectable gentlemen who had full-time subscriptions to the Bhakti Godhead magazine. and who recommended the public that this magazine that's being published by Goswami A.C. Bhaktivedanta Ji, that's what they called him, is of value for the entire world. It should be put in all the libraries and schools, because this magazine shows how the only way we are going to attain the perfection of life is by taking shelter of the service to God. And then Prabhupada, he wrote another article quoting the President of America, who at that time was President Eisenhower. Now, in America, because Prabhupada, of course, was always aiming for America, he saw that he wasn't having success in India. The Indians were all aiming for the West. So his philosophy was, if I go there and I import it, then the Indians will be interested in their own philosophy. So, in America, on all of the dollar bills, the motto of America, does anyone know? Yes, in God we trust. So President Eisenhower, he was speaking, he says that everyone is trying for peace, but peace will not come in the hands of the diplomats and the soldiers. So long as we are depending on material weapons to get peace, which in the Western concept, peace means prosperity and freedom, we will never be able to attain that peace. Our enemies will always win. Because it is the men and the women in this world who have high values and appreciation for God. This appreciation for God and their faith in God is what will bring peace in the world. So he quoted people who were actually God conscious, and in that way, because they were foreigners, the Indians would listen to him. He also quoted a popular magazine at that time, because India was pro-Russian then. It was called Soviet Land, the magazine. Now, in Soviet Land, they talked about industrial and economic development. And the author was saying that at this point in time, we have harnessed only 1% of solar energy. The primitives, and nowadays, they'll dry their grass to make hay in the solar energy. They might have some way of drying their food to preserve it. And by nature, the energy is stored in wood as fire. It's only 1% of what we could be doing with solar power. And then they gave different plans for how they were going to harness the energy of the sun to make more progress in industries. So Prabhupada, he had the perfect example of what he would call trying to, what were his words about, we're trying to we want to take material energy and use it, exploitation of material energy for sense gratification. That's how Prabhupada explained it. How the materialist is always looking for ways to exploit the material energy so that he can get more sense gratification. And he said, whatever titles we have, whatever scientific improvement we've made, it's just like decoration of a dead body. It's just like the jewel on the head of a cobra. Now, when we die, it doesn't matter what type of industrial and scientific improvements we made, because if we've lost the purpose of life, which is to seek out God, then our whole life has become useless. So he used this as an example to show that no, life is not meant for yes, scientific development is very nice if it's used in the service of the Lord, but that is not the purpose, just to advance scientifically and industrially for sense gratification. So Prabhupada gave very pertinent and very topical points, and therefore many people who were her subscribers, they missed his articles, they missed his writings. That was his outstanding asset, his faith in his spiritual master. He was sure that by following Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he would receive his blessings and the blessings of Lord Chaitanya. Although for the last 2 years he had followed any path that had opened as far as it had led, he had remained one-pointed, aimed at serving the order of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. He was confident. Sooner or later, he would obtain substantial backing, he would find a sympathetic audience, sincere workers would join him. Now, when did this come about? It didn't come about when Prabhupada was in India. And again, we'll go back to this Back to Godhead. This is the theme of this part of Prabhupada's life, because this was Prabhupada's tool. It was his mouthpiece, the Back to Godhead. He couldn't start up Back to Godhead again until 1960. He did only 2 editions in 58, and then he did about 12 editions in 1960 finally. After 1960, he had to concentrate on printing the Srimad Bhagavatam 3 volumes. He did one in first volume 61, and then in 62, 63, and then 65. So he was busy translating. And the editions of Back to Godhead in the 60s, 1960s, were quite different, because by that time Prabhupada was translating Nectar of Devotion, Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, and he was doing it verse by verse at that time. He was also translating Chaitanya Charitamrita, and he was translating Srimad Bhagavatam. And he was writing on his first printed book, which was Easy Journey to Other Planets. And he was writing the translation of the prayers of King Kulashekar. So Prabhupada had shifted his writing capacity into translation work so that he could print books. He felt that the books would be more successful than the 4-page tabloid, A Back to Godhead. So he incorporated his translations into his Back to Godhead magazines at that time. Now, when Prabhupada did go to America in 1965, in August, it took him about a year to get settled, and then in June, July of 1966, finally, he was able to get his first temple at 26 Second Avenue. He had his first initiations of 11 devotees on Janmashtami, and then his second initiation 15 days later, 5 devotees on Radhastami. And then in October 23rd to be exact, he initiated 2 more devotees. That was Gargamuni and a devotee named Ranchor. Now, just before those initiations, the last initiation in October, Prabhupada called Gargamuni, who was Greg at the time, and he told him he wanted to take him somewhere. They borrowed a van, a big car, and they went out to a part of New York City called Queens, to a country club. A country club, the only country club I've ever seen here in India is in Delhi, golf links. In golf links, they have a golf course. So in a country club, they play golf, and they have a big, a nice little rooms where the men drink and gamble together. And this country club wanted to sell their mimeograph machines. Now, in those days, in the 50s and 60s, we didn't have Xerox. We only had mimeograph machines. And a mimeograph machine, you had a sheet of, like what we have here, butter paper, and you have a hard piece of paper behind it. and you would type on that butter paper, which would make holes in the paper, and then you would roll it around a drum that put ink through those holes. And that was a mimeograph machine. So this country club, it was called a clubhouse, right, the clubhouse. They wanted to sell their 2 mimeograph machines for $150 each. So Prabhupada preached to them. He said, we're only a religious society, we have no money, and he was able to get both machines for $150. And he took them back to 26 Second Avenue, and there were 2 different ways to run it. One, you could run it automatically, that means it would go very, very fast, or you can do it manually, very, very slowly. So he put Ranchor in charge of the printing. And Ranchor, it was a 22-page, on October 23rd, the same day that he had the initiation of the 2 boys, he started the Back to Godhead magazine in America. 22 pages. And the cover they had printed outside to make it look very attractive. So when Ranchor printed it automatically, all the paper started flying and so much paper was wasted. So then he told Gargamuni to do it, and Gargamuni did it very slowly and very carefully, and that way no paper was wasted. And then Gargamuni took all the pages and he spent the whole night collating the pages. He made 500 copies of the Back to Godhead magazine. And then he went out the next day and he would distribute 30 to 40 magazines in a day. They charged 15 cents. And everyone would give a quarter and he wouldn't give them change. Prabhupada called him Gargamuni for that reason. So Prabhupada never lost sight of his Back to Godhead magazine. And now that he did do it in America, he was training his disciples how to write articles as well, again with this chopping technique. Later in the Back to Godhead magazine, there was a whole section called the Vedic Observer. And in the Vedic Observer, just like Prabhupada did, they would take topical, civic events, political events, events of social concern, and give the Vedic view of what, like abortion or addiction and things like that. And they would the disciples of Prabhupada would write articles according to the Vedic viewpoint. And no articles could be printed in Back to Godhead without Prabhupada's approval. On the day of my second initiation, I wrote an article, and as my offering to Prabhupada, I gave that article to him. And Prabhupada was so busy, thousands of disciples. He read the whole article, and he made spelling corrections, and he wrote on the side, like it was about pure devotional service. And after writing it so many times, pure devotional service, so many times, I started typing PDS, P, period D, pure devotional service. And then Prabhupada on the side, he wrote, spell it out. And then at the top of it, he wrote, print this in BTG. So that's the way Prabhupada was. He took personal concern for his Back to Godhead magazine. And he wanted to make sure that nothing was put in there that was not exactly according to the way he and his spiritual master would be preaching. A letter came to Abai in Vrindavan from his disciple, Acharya Prabhakar Mishra, and it gave Abai an idea. Acharya Prabhakar, who was in Bombay working as secretary of the Sanskrit department at the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, invited Srila Bhaktivedanta Prabhu to join him there for preaching together, just as in the old days. The founder-director of the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan was Governor K.M. Munshi, the same governor whose wife had pressured Abai to give up the Radha Memorial in Jhansi. But Acharya Prabhakar, having recently established a friendship with the governor, intimated to Abai that the governor might be willing to help. Thus, in January 1957, after assuring Mahant Gopal that he would return and that he would send 5 rupees a month for his room, Abai traveled to Bombay. So now that we have the biography of Acharya Prabhakar, yes, this is all exactly correct what was written here. The only difference in his biography is that he says that Prabhupada arrived in February of 1957. Because if you remember from last week, when Dr. Munshi kidnapped Acharya Prabhakar on December 20th, something like that, he said, you have to go immediately to Bombay. You can't even go back and get your belongings in Jhansi. Whatever you left in Jhansi, we will get for you in Bombay. You spend 15 days there, and then you have to go for the 15-day Sanskrit conference in Kurukshetra, which started from January 11th. So 11 plus 15, it went up to the 26th. And then Acharya Prabhakar said Prabhupada came after that particular Sanskrit conference. So Acharya Prabhakar, in hindsight, he said actually it was Krishna's desire that everything get closed down in Jhansi, because Jhansi was just a small city. And Prabhupada would not have been able to expand his preaching so well as he was going to be able to do here in Bombay and Delhi. Because when Acharya Prabhakar invited Prabhupada, he was staying at that time. Now, any of you who have been to Bombay, you know the Chowpatty area, Marine Drive. There's an area called Gowalia Tank. Now, Gowalia Tank is very famous because that was where Mahatma Gandhi made his first civil disobedience speech, where he said, do or die. It was 1942. And the British came and tear gassed all of the people there. So it was very famous politically. It was where the civil disobedience was born, actually. And right there, Acharya Prabhakar was staying in a place called Hari Bhavan, just close to the area. Gowalia also means before that time, there was a big tank of water, and the Gwalas used to bring all of the cows there to drink water. So in that way, it was also a very auspicious place. In the meantime, they covered over the tank. They made it into parks and schools and different meeting areas. But this is where Prabhupada came to stay. And Acharya Prabhakar, with his influence, he was able to help Prabhupada to restart the League of Devotees there in Bombay. He, with his contacts with the members of the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, like for instance, Mr. Chokshi, who was the secretary to Sumati Morarji, he was a member of Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan. And Acharya Prabhakar promised that he would introduce Prabhupada to Mr. Chokshi. And Mr. Chokshi said, all you have to do is get your passport, and I will send you on a ship to America. And then there were other very wealthy families. They gave in Churchgate an entire huge office building for Prabhupada to start. And here in Bombay, instead of calling it the League of Devotees, they called it the Vishva Vidya Pratishtan. And it was an open university. And they had regular courses. And they had a registrar who was a Dr. Krishna Dwivedi. And they all lived there in that, it was called Bhaskar Bhavan there at Churchgate. And they had an office over at the fort, Bombay Fort. So Prabhupada had a lot of success for those 2 years in Bombay with the help of Acharya Prabhakar and the other devotees there. He was giving classes, lectures regularly at the Tejpal Temple, in Juhu, in Vadala, at Churchgate, at their center also. And then Acharya Prabhakar talks about something very interesting that's not in here. I'll share it with you because it's a lesson for all of us. He said after some time, Prabhupada's youngest son, Vrindavan Chandra, wrote to him saying that he wanted to join him in Bombay. Now, if you remember, Prabhupada had turned over the Prayag pharmacy in Allahabad to his sons, and there was a huge theft of about 7,000 rupees worth of medicines and money, and then they sold the Prayag pharmacy and went back to Calcutta. And Prabhupada was very disappointed with his family at that time. So Acharya Prabhakar reminded Prabhupada that this is the same son who sold your pharmacy. You're inviting him now to Bombay. We only have just so much finances. You know what he's interested in. So Prabhupada, he had a soft place in his heart, of course, for his son and his family. That was the only son who was in any way interested in what Prabhupada was doing at the time. So he invited him, yes, you come, you help us. He knew typing. He said, Prabhupada assured Acharya Prabhakar, he's just going to type. He can't do any harm to us. So he came, and after a few months, the finances started to disappear. So Prabhupada had an idea, because if you remember, Prabhupada's father was a cloth merchant. So he went out and he bought 40 or 50 different types of cloth, and there at the Bhaskar Bhavan, there at Church Gate, he opened up a little cloth shop for his son to run, hoping that, all right, at least he'll make some money and we'll be able to go on with our work. After 6 months, his son closed the shop, took all the money, and went back to Calcutta. Then Prabhupada said, I'm finished now. I have no more soft spot in my heart for the family. Now, the Krishna devotees are my family. So this was the disappointment. We can try and try and try with some of our family members. Sometimes it's just not possible. And Prabhupada would later say, when he was in America, in Los Angeles, and then later in Seattle, he said, I gave up 5 children, and now I have 5,000 children. So sometimes we have to give up our attachments for a higher family, for a higher purpose in life, which is Prabhupada was very disappointed. He wanted so much for his family to join him, but they just weren't interested. Acharya Prabhakar got Abhay quarters in the faculty residence and introduced him to various scholars and religionists. They then attended a lecture by Governor Munshi, What is Wrong with the World? Afterwards, Abhay approached the governor, expressing his appreciation of the speech, but stressing that it would take a spiritual movement to avert the imminent global disasters. Without God consciousness, even Mr. Munshi's work in the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan would be a waste of time. Abhay spoke of his interest in reviving the League of Devotees, and he suggested how he might work within the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan to infuse the life of God consciousness into the governor's cultural projects. Governor Munshi responded by offering Abhay a post as honorary professor of Bhagavad Gita. Abhay accepted and gave the governor some copies of Back to Godhead, requesting that he read them in his spare time. So Srila Prabhupada, being such a great scholar, he was able to directly approach the governor, convince him that by combining the two, the League of Devotees and the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, then you would have the balance of the cultural and also the spiritual strength of God consciousness. And Dr. Munshi accepted that proposal and gave him a title and gave him an opportunity to lecture within the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan. As honorary professor of Bhagavad Gita, Abhay began each class with Hare Krishna Kirtan and then lectured on the Gita, presenting Lord Krishna as the Supreme Personality of Godhead. But he soon found his post confining. Within the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, he found little scope for reviving the League of Devotees. So this is when the Vishva Vidya Pratishthan was established in Bombay, when what Acharya Prabhupada would do was he would work in the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And then he would go down to Church Gate, to the Bhaskar Bhavan, and until 9 o'clock at night, he would be with Srila Prabhupada working on the subject matters and the different lectures that Prabhupada was having all over Bombay at that time. And that way Prabhupada made very, very good contacts that he kept up until the end of his life. Because in that area in southern Bombay, you know, there are very many wealthy people there, many religious wealthy people. So they were very attracted to Srila Prabhupada's lectures. They would invite him to their homes. And even after Acharya Prabhupada had to leave Bombay, because he was appointed here at Curzon Road in Delhi to the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, Prabhupada continued with all these contacts he made, living in their homes for a week at a time, holding lecture programs. So he cut off his confining preaching attempts to preach within the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, and he established himself within the Vishva Vidya Pratishthan, or the League of Devotees in Bombay. Then, along with other members of the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, Abai attended the 5th annual convention of the World Academy of Sanskrit at Kurukshetra, where 5,000 years before Lord Krishna had spoken Bhagavad Gita. India's President, Dr. Rajendra Prasad, Governor Munshi, and many scholars and pundits from all over India participated in the discourses. But everyone there had his own thing to say, apart from the conclusions of Lord Krishna. So Abai considered the meeting a waste of time. Since he was not scheduled to speak, since the non-devotional discussions on the Gita disturbed him, and since he saw that nothing practical would come of such a theoretical meeting, he left Kurukshetra and returned to Vrindavan. So this was the 1958. And Acharya Prabhupada was also there with Prabhupada at Kurukshetra. And I made 2 mistakes last week. First of all, I said that Prabhupada spoke. So he did not speak at this gathering at Kurukshetra. Instead, he left in a very disappointed state. And then also, the closest friend of Prabhupada here in Vrindavan, Nrsimhaballabha Goswami of the Radharaman Temple, his son's name was Kunjaballabha Goswami. And as a young man, Kunjaballabha Goswami used to learn from Srila Prabhupada. His father encouraged him, you go and learn, he's a great saintly person. And then there was another young man named Chaitanya Goswami, and it was his family that ran the Sadbhuj temple. So I just mixed up the names last week, you please excuse me.